A storm came through Mayberry County a little over a week ago. The rivers washed out the road, trees fell on the power lines, and most everyone hunkered down in their homes to wait for the storm to blow over. The only problem is that it never did. It's been 10 days and it's still raining. I don't know how my phone got this signal, but there's something horrible going on up here you all need to know about. Your town could be next. I crouched down in our dingy living room, placing yet another bottle under yet another leak. Our roof leaked during normal rain already, and this storm was making it look as if someone had thrown a hedgehog at a water balloon. At least a dozen wet spots were scattered around, each pinging down water droplets rhythmically. I've been trying to document everything happening in the town, including recording some of the audio of the storm. Dad was sitting in the glow of our furnace, a half-empty whiskey bottle still in his hand. I shot a look at the still glowing embers inside. The furnace was the one upside to being white trash, I figured. When the power goes out, we can still stay warm. A look at the few remaining logs I'd stacked up in the corner by our TV told me how much time we'd have heat for. Enough for a few more days, if we had the self-control to ration them. I looked back at my dad, drool dripping from the corner of his mouth. Self-control had never been one of his strong suits. The forest outside was lit up by a flash of lightning, and I braced myself. Less than a second later, the house was rocked by thunder that shook the glass in the windows and pounded the front door. It took me a second to realize that the pounding on the front door hadn't stopped, even after the rumbling thunder had died away. I went to the door and pulled it open. Luna Snyder stood on my front porch wearing a backpack and a raincoat, her blonde hair pulled into a ponytail that dripped water. I let her in and shut the door behind us. She shot a look at Dad's comatose figure, then looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "Still?" she asked. "Yeah, I know. How's your mom doing?" I said. Luna walked up to the sink and wrung her ponytail into it. "She's still got her hands full. A tree fell on the Dawson's place while they were sleeping. The only one who died was their dog, but the rest of them got hurt pretty bad. She's doing what she can." I shot a look at the trees surrounding my house. If one of those fell in on us, there'd be nothing left but a hole that smelt of booze and mold. It was early evening, but the clouds were so thick that I'd have believed you if you told me it was midnight. The trees whipped back and forth, almost advertising their destructive weight. I fought down a shudder and looked away. "Listen," Luna said, pulling a note out of her backpack and handing it to me. "My mom needs some more medicine and wants an update on the town. Everything she needs we can get if we make a quick run to the pharmacy on Main Street and pass by the fire station to check on Stanley and the messages there." She shot me a sheepish grin. "So, Milton, you feel like helping me out and getting soaked again?" There was something about her face that made me almost smile, despite everything going on. I looked over the supplies written in her mom's scrawled handwriting and passed it back to her. "Yeah, just let me grab my coat and we'll get going." I threw on an old pair of rain boots and a coat, neither of which would be of much use at keeping the water out. I opened one of my high school notebooks and scrawled out a quick note to Dad about where we were going and set it on the counter. Luna stood by the door, anxious to leave. I got up to go and shot another glance at my dad, and then threw a log on the fire to keep him warm. Mom would have approved. Stepping outside was like entering a rock concert. Freezer and airsoft shooting range all mixed into one. The rain pelted us from every side, whipped into a frenzy by the wind. We continued down the street, conversation made difficult by the storm. I kept an eye on the houses on either side as we passed by. Power had gone out on the first day of the storm, and I doubted that many houses had extra food. Luna and I had talked the situation over with her mom every time I headed over to her house. None of us had any idea what kind of storm could last for this long, especially a storm as powerful as this one. Mayberry County is situated high in the mountains of West Virginia, so we're no strangers to storms. But like this? No one had ever seen anything like it. After around 20 minutes of walking, we made it to Main Street. We learned on a previous excursion that someone had left the front door to the pharmacy unlocked, so we flipped on our flashlights and headed inside. The beams flashed across the darkened interior, revealing a man crouched down by the checkout machines. He jumped and spun to stare at us, shielding his eyes from the light. "Hi, Mr. Harrington," Luna said, angling her light to the floor. Mr. Harrington grabbed a pill bottle sitting on the counter, slipping it into his pocket. He wiped his still wet face with the same hand he'd used to grade my physics paper last semester. There was a look of pure panic in his eyes, though. "Luna? Milton?" he stuttered. "Where are you? How?" He seemed to notice our flashlights for the first time. Turn those damn things off," he hissed, waving his hands at our lights. A red line of blood trickled from a cut on the side of his neck. Luna flipped her light off, and after a short pause, I did the same, reducing Mr. Harrington to a black silhouette. I'd been fearing this for a few days now. My childhood had been spent watching enough apocalypse films to know that apparently people turned into panicked animals in situations like these. I stepped forward, pulling Luna behind me and cursing myself for not bringing the pistol my dad kept in his closet. Stupid, stupid, stupid. If he attacked us, it would be my fault. How'd you get hurt, Mr. Harrington?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "I was at the fire station." Mr. Harrington then cut himself off. A flash of lightning lit up the inside of the shop. Mr. Harrington was looking away from us, instead staring into the darkness at the back of the shop. He let out a moan that was cut off by a roll of crashing thunder. Then he turned and ran at us. I braced myself for his charge, but Mr. Harrington didn't run at me or Luna. He ran for the door, sprinting out into the rain. I let out a low sigh and sat down hard on the linoleum, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, making my knees weak. Water dripped off the end of my nose onto the speckled white and black floor. Luna flipped her light back on, staring into the back of the store. "Did you hear what he said about the fire station?" she said. I reached out and flipped my own light back on. "Yeah, maybe he tried attacking it and Stanley fought him off. I don't really care though. Come on. Let's get your mom's stuff and get out of here." Luna nodded, unzipped her backpack, and began making her way down the aisles. I jumped over the prescription desk and pushed open the window to try to get to the drugs they kept back there. After a few minutes throwing pills into bottles, we were done. We headed back into the rain, walking down Main Street towards the fire station. The fire station was one of the only places left in Mayberry County that still had power. Stanley, the fire chief, ran the place. He had a network of walkie-talkies linked to several houses throughout the county. If there was an emergency, they could call out to him and he'd be able to get help. With the roads out and the town isolated, it was probably the only help anyone could expect. I reached back and grabbed Luna's hand as we made our way down Main Street. "Wouldn't want to get separated, you know," I shouted over the wind. She squeezed my hand and picked up her pace. Stanley had tried making contact with the outside world, but our town was already hard-pressed to get radio signals. It was situated high in the mountains, and that meant that radio waves were blocked and bounced around too much. And in the storm and the loss of power, that meant that we'd been cut off with the outside world since the first night that storm had rolled through. We rounded the corner to the station. I shielded my eyes from the rain with my hand, confused. The normally bright lights of the station were out. I crept forward, crunching a piece of broken glass under my boot. Shards of glass littered the sidewalk in front of the station from the shattered front doors. I looked around to see if anyone was watching us, but with the rain, it was impossible to tell. I flipped on my flashlight and stepped inside. "Stanley?" I shouted. The room was lit up by a flash of lightning followed by a roar of thunder an instant later. I jumped, cursed, and dropped my flashlight. It hit the ground and rolled forward, coming to a stop by a disembodied hand laying on the floor. "No," Luna whispered under her breath. Oh my God, no. I stepped forward, scooping up the light, pointing it further down the hallway. The rest of Stanley was just inside a room off the main hallway. He'd been cleanly cut into a dozen or so separate pieces. Most of my mind was screaming in horror now, screaming the same way Luna had begun screaming behind me. But another smaller part took in the scene with a logic so remote and detached that it disturbed me more than the body. Interesting, this part of my mind said. Why isn't there any blood? The meat's all there, but I see only a few stray drops spattering the ground. How did that happen? What kind of knife could make cuts as clean as those? I flashed my light on Stanley's map of Mayberry County hanging on the wall. In the bottom right corner of the map, he'd written a legend. It said, X equals family confirmed dead. Question mark equals no contact, probably dead. /# equals small number of family members in home, at risk of attack. Stanley had crossed out a dozen houses on the western border of the town and placed question marks over several more. The pound symbol was scattered around different homes, including the fire station where we were standing. It was also over my own home in the eastern portion of the town. From the darkness further in the facility, a guttural clack sounded out, followed by what sounded like someone dragging metal over concrete, and it grew louder. I spun around, grabbed Luna, and ran out into the storm, almost as if sensing our presence. It increased in volume and intensity, and I found it hard to stay on my feet with the wind and the rain. The next half hour passed in a blur, with wind, rain, and running. Luna and I sat in the living room as Mrs. Snyder tended to the youngest Dawson girl. The girl had a compound fracture in her ankle and was sweaty with pain. Mrs. Snyder changed her bandage and gave her one of the pills we'd gathered before laying her back down to sleep. She pulled over a chair and focused all her attention on us to hear what had happened. Luna explained to her mom most of what we'd seen, but she paused when it was time to describe the fire station. Mrs. Snyder, I cut in. Stanley was cut up into little pieces, but there was no blood anywhere. The Dawson girl then sat up, staring at us with eyes shot full of pain. That's how Bernie was. I filled his bowl with dog food, but he was in the kitchen all cut up. Then the storm blew the tree down. Mrs. Snyder gently pushed her back down on the couch. Go to sleep, she said. Her voice was kind, but held a firm note of command. The Dawson girl fell back asleep and closed her eyes, asleep almost immediately. We told her about the map Stanley had set up at the fire station, how it had marked my house as being at risk. Mrs. Salinger, too, Luna said from beside me. What? I asked. I looked at the map, she said almost absent-mindedly. In this part of town, there was a symbol on your house and on Mrs. Salinger's. Luna's mom then looked between us, her eyes sharp. Listen, here's what we're going to do. You'll both go get Milton's dad, and then you'll swing by Mrs. Salinger's and bring them both here. We'll make room. My mind flashed back to the half-full bottle of booze I'd left in my dad's hand. My dad might not be in a state to walk, especially in this storm. Some of the sharpness in her eyes gave way, revealing pity. Fine. You'll both head to your dad's place. You'll stay the night with him until he's in a state to move. Then tomorrow morning, you'll bring him and Mrs. Salinger here. We agreed, slung our coats back on, and set out through the storm. It had weakened considerably. I allowed myself a faint hope that it might finally be ending. When we reached my house, I saw that the half-empty bottle was now entirely empty. Dad was still passed out in his same stupid armchair. I walked into his closet, grabbed the 2 bottles of booze I knew he kept there, and smashed them against the pavement on our back patio. I cursed under my breath before returning to his closet and grabbing his gun. I knew we might need it. Luna watched me, her expression a mix of concern and approval. I slid the pistol into my backpack and sighed. We should probably get ready for bed. We then changed into thick sweaters and sweatpants, though they did almost nothing to dull the cold. I pointed to the narrow twin bed in my bedroom. You can sleep there. I'll pull over some comforters and sleep on the ground beside you." We then laid down, and the rain now faded to a patter that somehow comforted me despite everything. I stared up from the ground at my motionless ceiling fan, unable to sleep. "You think my mom's gonna be okay?" Luna asked from above me on the bed. "Yeah, don't worry, she'll be fine. Mr. and Mrs. Dawson are with her, and they're mostly uninjured. And on top of that, your mom is the smartest person I've ever met." I let some bitterness creep into my voice, unlike a certain drunk I know. "I'm scared, Milton." "Yeah, Luna, I am too." Luna cleared her throat. I wouldn't mind if you joined me. If you want." I felt my heart skip for a moment. Did she mean up on the bed? What else could she mean? I sat up, watching her for a moment to see if I'd misunderstood. She then lifted her thick comforter and I crawled underneath it, pulling another blanket to double layer on top of us. Luna then wrapped her arms around me, burying her face against my chest. "You're warm," she said. "Yeah, well, you're freezing." Luna let out a muffled laugh, and a moment of silence passed between us. "I'm really sorry about your dad." The words cut deep, and I let out a low, long sigh. "You want to know what the funny thing is?" I said. "My dad really is a good man. He's kind, he's funny, he's thoughtful. But it's that damn booze that gets him like this. When my mom had the accident, he turned into this, and I haven't seen the old him in years." Another long moment of silence passed by. "Well, I hope I get to meet him someday," she said. "Yeah, I hope you do too." I pulled her tight, and soon we were both fast asleep. I woke up spitting out Luna's long blonde hair. The sky held the unmistakable red hue of a sunrise. Luna stirred, opened her eyes, and pulled her hair off me with a sheepish grin. "Hey, Milton," my dad said from the doorway. His face held the same pinched expression it always had when he was hungover. "Do you know what happened to the booze in my—" His voice trailed off. He noticed Luna. "Oh, hey, Luna." Luna froze. Her face colored bright red. She shot upright and bent over in a half nod and a half bow. Hi, Mr. Maves. This isn't what it looks like." And she trailed off, as if realizing nothing she could say would improve our situation. After the initial awkwardness passed, we explained to him what we'd seen and what our plan was. He was hesitant at first, but when he heard Luna's mom would have had headache medicine, he agreed. We ate what little food remained at my house for breakfast and set off towards Mrs. Salinger's place. The rain dripped down from the leaves above us, now no stronger than an average afternoon rainstorm. Hoped that it might actually be oversurged in my gut as we reached the house. "Mrs. Salinger," I said as I ran up the steps, only realizing at the last moment that the door was swinging open on its hinges. I paused on the front door, looking into the house. A black silhouette was standing in the living room. It looked to be around 6 feet tall, and my eyes were drawn to where it had 2 hooked blades on the ends of its arms instead of hands. One hook of the creature held what looked like a piece of Mrs. Salinger's foot. It made a horrific slurp as it sucked on the stump. Luna then ran up the stairs beside me. "Milton?" She saw it. It rose up to its full height, turning to face us and letting out the same guttural clack we'd heard in the fire station. We turned and ran down the steps, grabbing my dad as we passed him. The storm kicked up immediately, from a simple patter to a full-blown tempest. Wind whipped from every side, but we kept running. After just a few seconds, trees began to topple around us. We fell to the ground and cowered as the wind, rain, and hail all battered us. After what seemed like an eternity, it died down a little. I shot a glance around, half expecting to see the black silhouette leaning over us, but it was nowhere to be seen. We made it back to Luna's place and had a minor breakdown. Mrs. Snyder listened to our hysterics with rapt attention and silence. When we were done, she handed each of us a banana and told us to eat. Listen, she said. Here's what I figure. That thing must be vulnerable. Otherwise, why would it need the storm? She looked at me. You brought that gun, right? I pulled it from my bag and set it on the table. Good. She sat back, rubbing her eyes. A part of my mind wondered how much sleep she'd been getting for the past week. Finally, she sat forward again. We'll figure something out. For now, you should probably eat those peels. They're edible, and we're just about out of food. I stared out through the window at the waves of water that were somehow still pouring down before turning back into the living room. Luna Snyder knelt down next to a couch, wiping Jill's forehead with a cool rag. I knelt down beside Luna, watching Jill's face. She was sleeping, thankfully. The poor girl's broken leg was infected. She'd spent most of the past 12 hours in a feverish haze. Luna reached out and grabbed my hand. I squeezed it, not knowing what to say. My stomach ached with hunger. Mrs. Snyder stuck her head into the living room. Luna, Milton, come with me. Luna shot a look at me, her expression grim. Her long blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail that was still dripping water from when we'd gone out earlier that day. We were both only 18, far too young to be expected to know what to do in a situation like this. We followed Luna's mom to the kitchen where my father and Mr. and Mrs. Dawson stood at the counter. Jill doesn't have much time, Mrs. Snyder said. But with the roads washed out, driving is off the table. She rubbed her forehead, her face bearing the same grim expression I'd seen earlier on Luna. It'll take a day or two to reach the nearest town on foot, but I don't see another option. Well, we'd need food, I'd said. None of us have eaten a full meal in days. If we're going to be trekking through the woods, we'll need energy. Milton and I will search for some, Luna said in a firm tone. You guys need to stay here and look after Jill. Thunder cracked and rolled outside. None of us jumped. We'd all grown accustomed to it by now. Mrs. Snyder drummed her fingers on the surface of the table, staring at her daughter with a mix of exasperation and thoughtfulness. Fine. Don't stray too far from the house, she said. And Luna nodded. We left the conversation at the kitchen and walked to her room to prepare our clothes for the trip. So, where are we going? Luna asked me, sticking an arm through a rain jacket. There's a trailer park a mile down McElroy Avenue, I said. I guess that the people living there probably left to search for better shelter. What I didn't tell her was that my family had lived there until I was 10. Luna already knew I was white trash, but I still found myself trying to hide parts of my family's background. Her mom was a doctor, after all. We basically came from completely different planets. I pulled on my worn rain jacket and laced up my boots. They do almost nothing against the amount of rain that we were going to be walking through, but I figured I was fighting off the wind more than the rain. It was bitter cold out there, especially once you were soaking wet. I pulled on my backpack too, checking to be sure that my dad's pistol was inside. When we'd gathered our things, we walked to the front door. Stepping out into the rain meant a return of the now familiar feeling of getting blasted in the face by a fire hose. The wind whipped each raindrop against any exposed skin like miniature BB pellets. The roar of the wind and crackling thunder made conversation all but impossible. I reached out and grabbed Luna's hand, in part to keep from getting separated in the darkness. In part because something about being out in the wind and rain was flooding the animal part of my brain with adrenaline, and in part because I was pretty sure I was in love with her. We reached the trailer park a little after 6 p.m., though it was dark enough that I'd had believed you if you told me it was closer to midnight. We started searching the trailers one by one. Someone had clearly already passed through the park. Most of the trailers had broken front doors, and all were empty. I cursed under my breath. If we didn't get any food, there was no way we'd make it on a multi-day journey out of town. I was so hungry that it was giving me nausea. I sat down hard on the steps leading to a trailer. Luna watched me, though it was hard to read her expression through the darkness, rain, and hood of her rain jacket. She reached out and pulled me to my feet, then pointed off in the distance. A rundown house occupied the lot next to the trailer park. reminding me of my own house in a way. A few rusted-out cars languished in the tall grass of the front lawn. Luna pointed to it again, shouting something that was lost in the rain and the wind. I nodded, and we both set off towards it. I inspected the ground, allowing myself to feel hope when I didn't spot any footprints in the mud. Maybe we'd actually find some food in this guy's place. After shouting uselessly at the house from the front yard, we moved closer. There was almost no chance that the guy was actually going to be able to hear us over the downpour. I ran up the front steps and pounded on the front door. When there was no response, I tried the handle. The door swung open, revealing a dark, empty house. "Hello?" I called out, taking a few cautious steps inside. When I heard no response again, I called Luna up to join me. We walked into the kitchen and pulled open the cupboards. There, high up on a shelf, were several cans of food. Ravioli, chili, even a few cans of baked beans. I let out a gasp of happiness, grabbed a spoon from a drawer, and dug into the can of ravioli. After a few bites, I passed it to Luna, who finished the rest. We took turns scraping the inside of the can with a spoon until it was clean. I've eaten some delicious food in my life. Fresh salmon, venison, my mom's spaghetti with white sauce, but nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever been half as tasty as that cold can of ravioli I shared with Luna. We got to our feet and stuffed the rest of the cans into my backpack. I turned to look at Luna, fighting back a bark of laughter that was bubbling out of me. Luna was clearly fighting back a grin too. "You've got some sauce?" I said, pointing to the corner of her mouth. "How embarrassing," she said, licking it away. "I'm never going to be able to," and her voice trailed off, looking out towards the front of the house. I turned to follow her gaze. The still open front door gave a view of the rusted-out cars. One of the black figures stood in the front yard, half obscured by the falling rain. "It's one of those things," I whispered. "Should we try to shoot at it?" Luna cut me off with a hand on my shoulder. We crept closer to the front door. The figure was thin and tall, nearly 7 feet, judging by the height of a nearby rusted truck chassis. It was all black and had 2 of the same hooks on the ends of its hands. The 2 additional black figures emerged from behind a nearby car. I can't explain exactly what it was, but something about them was triggering every fight or flight instinct in my brain. I backed away, accidentally hitting something with my elbow. The now empty can of ravioli fell off the counter and hit the ground with a clatter. I looked down at it in horror, only moving when Luna grabbed my hand. We ran down the hallway towards the bedroom. Luna slid open a closet and shoved me inside before running to a nearby window and sliding it open. I fumbled around in my bag to pull out the pistol while she ran back to the closet and jumped in beside me. She slid the door shut with a grim expression. "Why did you?" And Luna put a finger over her mouth. The rain, which had already been coming down hard, suddenly picked up and became deafening. Thunder crackled and rumbled over the house constantly. It was as if the storm itself knew we were inside the house. We sat in the darkness, watching the slats of light from the bedroom. When one of the dark figures entered the bedroom, it took everything I had to not shoot at it immediately. I bit the inside of my cheek, watched, and waited. The black figure made a guttural clack sound. Another creature joined him in the room, and then they left it behind. The storm died down to its usual patter, but we stayed in the closet for at least another hour. When I finally pushed open the door, it was to a truly darkened house. The wind and rain from the open window had soaked the inside of the man's bedroom. Luna and I stared at each other for a moment. Then she hugged me. I held her tight, trying to calm us both as her small frame began shaking. We stayed locked like that for a few minutes. "That was smart, opening the window," I said. "Made them think we ran off that way." When we eventually separated, I turned to look at the ground where the black figure had been standing. "Interesting," I heard myself say. "What's interesting?" Luna asked, rubbing at her face. "Well, the storm kicked up while those things were nearby again." Luna watched me with dark eyes. "We can think about it later. For now, we need to get back to my mom." Yeah, okay," I said, tightening my backpack. We set off again through the rain. The first few minutes passed without incident, but then the rain began to pick up again. It rained harder, the wind blew faster, and the thunder cracked the sky more often. I grabbed Luna's hand and began running down the road with the pistol clenched in my right hand. The storm continued to get worse, flooding my body with adrenaline. I kept looking around, trying to spot the black figures. Instead, I saw a church building nearby with what looked like impossibly a light. I turned and ran towards the light as the storm continued to intensify. I half expected to get hooked by a tall, thin figure at any moment. I kept running. The only thing visible to my rain-blinded eyes was the light from the inside of the church. We finally made it. We stood in front of the church, the light, and two men pointing rifles at us. "Please," I said. "They're right behind us." One of the men walked towards me, snatched the pistol out of my hand, and then motioned for us to enter the doorway behind him. Somehow, impossibly, the inside of the church was lit by emergency lighting. We passed several Sunday school classrooms that had been converted into sleeping quarters. The two men led us to a balding man in his early 50s. "Bishop," one of the men said, handing my pistol over to him. "We found these two outside carrying this." "And you left your door unguarded?" he asked. "Go back." The guard nodded and jogged back the way he'd come. The man he'd called Bishop then looked over at us, his face softening slightly. "Who are you two?" "I'm Luna," Luna said, "and this is my brother Milton. There was something chasing us outside." I wasn't sure why she was lying about being my sister, but I stayed silent. I'd long since figured out that Luna generally knew what she was doing. Bishop's face hardened. He called over a nearby woman and whispered something into her ear before looking back at us. "We've seen them too. They're probably still nearby, which means leaving would be a death sentence." He looked both of us over again with piercing eyes. "You're welcome to spend the night here." "Thank you," I said. "We appreciate the offer." Bishop racked the slide of my dad's pistol and ejected the magazine, inspecting it. "This will be returned to you when you leave," he said, and looked down the hallway of the church, and then called over a dark-haired woman. "Honey, can you show these two to a spot to sleep?" The woman nodded and motioned for us to follow her. She led us to an interior basketball court where, to my shock, nearly 100 people had set up cots, sleeping bags, and air mattresses. The woman led us to a spot on the ground. "We're out of pads and air mattresses," she said. "You can find plenty of blankets along the back wall, though." I thanked the woman and left to grab an armful of blankets. Luna took them from me and arranged them into a makeshift bed. I stripped myself of my wet raincoat, boots, and socks before lying down on the pile of blankets beside her. We talked quietly for a few minutes about small things as the adrenaline slowly faded from my body. The sudden change in tone from fear and tension to safety and peace and security was giving me whiplash. The only thing that kept it from feeling like a dream was the constant patter of the rain on the roof overhead, and the occasional crack of thunder that shook the building. "Quiet time," a man's voice announced. The lights in the room switched off. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm thinking that these people have guards on all the entrances at all times," Luna said. "And now I'm thinking that we left my mom without any protection." "Yeah," I said, flipping over to stare up at the now dark ceiling. "That's a problem for tomorrow, though. The sun will come out tomorrow. You bet your bottom dollar there'll be a sun," I said. Luna gave out a groan. "That's the thing, Milton. I haven't seen the sun in weeks." "Tomorrow," I said, and turned onto my side and pulled her tight. Something wet splashed the side of my head. I woke with a jerk, spinning around wildly, looking for one of the black creatures. Storm walkers, the church members had started calling them. Instead, I saw Luna standing over me holding 2 cups of water and a sheepish expression. "Very funny," I said, rubbing my now damp hair. Well, I didn't expect your reaction to be that violent. She then handed me one of the cups. I grunted and took a few gulps. It's strange. We were in the middle of a more than month-long thunderstorm, and yet we still woke up thirsty every day. I took a look around the gymnasium where we'd spent the night. Families were talking together, and a few kids were running back and forth along one of the walls. I drained the rest of the cup as a tall blond man, armed with some kind of combat rifle, approached us. "Bishop wants to talk to you," he said. He looked to be in his early 20s. I got to my feet and followed him and Luna to an office where Bishop was standing over a map. The blond man leaned against the back wall as Bishop nodded towards us. "We've talked it over," Bishop said. "We'd like to invite you to stay here." "Well, I appreciate the offer." I then glanced at Luna. "But our family is still outside, and we can't leave them." Bishop looked thoughtful. "I can respect that. I have a proposition for you both." He then pointed down at one of the streets on the map of the town. "Here, the Marstons. A family in our congregation decided to wait out the storm in their own home. That was before we learned about the stormwalkers. I want them back here at the church. At the very least, I want to know if they're still alive." Bishop then pointed out at the young blond man who'd brought us from the auditorium from where he leaned against the back wall. "Jonathan here served a deployment in Iraq with the Marines. I'll send him with you when you go." Jonathan then approached the table. "Bishop, I'd prefer to go alone. With their equipment." He then trailed off, looking down at my ratty shoes and coat. "I'd just get slowed down. If they tell me their family's address and you give me a map, I'll bring them all back by tomorrow night." "No, no way. You know the rules. No one goes out alone, and I can't afford to send out any other guards with you." Jonathan straightened. "The three of you will check on the Marstons in your own family, then bring them back here," Bishop explained. He then turned to look at us. "Do that, and you'll all be welcomed into our congregation." I looked back at Jonathan, and he was watching us with a serious expression. "We'll talk it over," Luna said. "Of course, please do," said Bishop. Jonathan looked up at the roof of the building as if he could see the storms through it. "Decide quickly." He shot a look at Bishop. "We don't have much time." Bishop's face paled, but he nodded and fished in a drawer for a set of keys before dismissing us with a nod. We left his office and made our way down the hallway to a deserted portion of the church. "Listen, Milton, I've been thinking," Luna said. "Sounds like a nice change of pace." I gave a half-hearted grin at that. "I'm still holding a cup of water if you're feeling too dry," she said, raising it threateningly. I held up my hands in surrender. "Oh, please no." Luna then lowered the cup and sighed. "I just don't think our old plan's going to work. Hiking to the next town, even with the food we gathered, is just... Jill only has a few days before it's too late. We need a better endgame." I considered what she was saying. She was right about Jill. Dawson girl was already feverish when we'd left yesterday. "All right, so what? You want us to take his offer and just hope they feel like spending their medical supplies on us?" I was rubbing my forehead. "Get escorted by Captain America, a complete stranger who we've never met?" Luna stared at me, a shy smile growing across her face. "I don't like the idea. I mean, how can we..." I cut myself off. "What? What's the problem?" "Captain America?" she asked. I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, served in the Marines and all." "You're jealous, aren't you?" she said. "Jealous? Why the fuck would I be jealous?" "I have no idea," she said. Then she set down her cup on a nearby table, reached for my face, and pulled me down to kiss me. My eyes flashed open wide, but after a moment of shock, I closed them and pulled her close. Thunder roared over the roof of the church, making us both jump. The rain that had been quietly pattering increased to a deafening roar. My heart was already racing, so I took the progression in the storm with surprising calmness. That is, until the gunshots started ringing out from the front of the church. We rushed towards the commotion as the storm continued to increase. Bishop stood in front of a utility closet, fumbling with his keys. Jonathan stood beside him, whispering urgently. 5 other men and women stood there, waiting with anxious expressions. "No," Bishop said, shoving a key into the lock. The door swung open, revealing an array of guns. The gathered men and women rushed inside, grabbing shotguns and rifles. Bishop reappeared holding 2 pistols and a canvas pouch that contained a few extra magazines. He handed me back my dad's gun and pressed an unfamiliar pistol into Luna's hand. Jonathan racked his rifle. "The stormwalkers are attacking the church from the front," he said. "If we sneak out the back, we can make it." Bishop nodded. "Go now." Jonathan unslung his rifle from his shoulder and ran towards the back. I loaded a magazine into my pistol, racked the slide, and ran after him, with Luna close behind. We burst into the storm. The rain and wind deafened us. I paused to look behind just as 4 separate lightning bolts struck the roof of the church. Bits of charred roofing sprayed us as we continued to run. We continued running, only slowing down when the storm had died down a few blocks later. I pressed my fingers into a cramp on my side, breathing hard. Jonathan raised his hand and then slowed to a stop. Luna was breathing hard now. "How did you know that we didn't have much time? How did you know there weren't any of those creatures behind the church?" Jonathan looked away. "It doesn't matter." "It doesn't matter?" Luna asked. "It sounds to me like it matters a hell of a lot." Jonathan ignored her, taking a drink from a water bottle. He looked up the street, then shook his head. "I ain't from this town. My family moved here while I was deployed." He was looking around now, and we didn't grab the map. Well, I saw where Bishop pointed. It's a dozen miles away, more or less. It's going to take us a few hours walking to get there. Jonathan slung his rifle over his shoulder. He felt safe, I realized. Somehow he knew that there were no stormwalkers near here. "A few hours," Jonathan said, and nodded. "Well, let's get started then." I stuffed my pistol into my jacket pocket, but kept a hand on it. Jonathan somehow knew where they were or where they would be. I didn't like that, not one bit. I reached out with my other hand to grab Luna's, and then started walking. The rain continued to pour down. Jonathan led the way ahead of us with a rifle strapped across his back, setting a brisk pace that was leaving me out of breath. He wasn't carrying the rifle in his hands, a decision that confused me. I'd seen the black creatures. They'd killed a few of my friends. They were so black that the only way to see them in detail was at the edge of their silhouettes. The creatures were tall and all had long, sharpened hooks instead of hands. I shuddered, pausing when Luna grabbed my hand. She said something that was lost to the pounding rain and rushing wind. I squeezed her hand anyway, then dropped it to check that my dad's pistol was still tucked in my jacket pocket. After a few hours of walking, my boots and socks were soaked through with the rain. My fingers were numb with the cold, and I was half deafened by the regular roaring thunder overhead. But we'd finally reached the end of Luna Street. Jonathan turned around and gestured us closer. "You two go and get your family. I'll go check on the Marstons further down. I'll be back here in an hour or 2. "Nah, I don't think so," I shouted. "We're coming with you. That's what Bishop said." The wind whipped raindrops into my eyes, but it was still easy to see the annoyed expression on Jonathan's face. "If we want to make it back to the chapel before nightfall, you're going to have to make sure your family is ready." "I can go," Luna said. "My house is another 15 minutes of walking down this road." "No way," I said. "What if there's one of those black creatures near our house?" Jonathan shook his head. "There are no stormwalkers anywhere near here." "Well, how could you know that?" He stared at me, his eyes hard. "I just do. She'll be fine." I turned to look at Luna, and she nodded. "I'll be back in an hour or 2. One way or another," I said. Jonathan and I set off down the rain-flooded street, stepping over fallen branches and around the deeper piles of mud. I had questions to ask him, but the wind and rain made that all but impossible. An hour later or so, Jonathan came to a stop, then turned up a long, windy driveway that cut through some trees. I followed close behind, sweeping the trees for any black silhouettes. The driveway opened up to a clearing with a single 2-story house. I breathed a sigh of relief. One way or another, that meant we were finally getting out of the rain. We walked up the steps to the porch. I lowered the hood of my raincoat and rubbed the water from my eyes while Jonathan banged down the door. "Bill?" he shouted. "Marge?" He waited a few seconds, then banged again. When there was no response, he tried the handle. The door opened into the dark house. I pulled out the pistol from my jacket pocket, images of the creatures flashing through my mind. Jonathan shot me a look and waved for me to put the gun away. "Why?" I asked. "Because there aren't any storm walkers nearby." I stuck the gun back into my jacket pocket, but kept a hand on the butt of the pistol. We stepped inside. Jonathan flipped on a flashlight. It was still early in the afternoon, but the clouds and rain were thick enough that the inside of the house was lit by nothing more than dark blue shadows and the occasional flash of lightning. Jonathan called out into the empty house again as we stepped forward. I shut the door behind me and locked it. We were halfway through the living room when a man stepped out of the kitchen. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jonathan stiffened. "Where are Bill and Marge?" The man in the kitchen was clean-shaven, thin, and had a voice that made me think he had to have been in his late 50s. I couldn't see his face very well, though his silhouette was outlined by the occasional flash of lightning behind him. "Well, I'm not sure who that is," he said. "Well, you're standing in their house." Jonathan's voice was hard now. The man looked around at the house as if noticing it for the first time. "Oh, well, I'm afraid this house was empty when I got here. I've been hunkering down out here for the past few days." Jonathan looked around at the room and then nodded. "I see. Well, we'll be going then." No, let me make you a cup of coffee first," the man said. "I haven't talked with anyone in days." Jonathan looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "All right, we'll stay for a few minutes. I want to hear if you found any signs about where the family that lived here may have gone." They both sat down in the living room, but I stayed standing. "Is there a bathroom here?" I asked. The man pointed down the hallway. "Fill the tank with that bucket of water I got in there when you're done." I walked down the hall into the bathroom. It was very dark, so I pulled out a flashlight and kept it pointed at the ceiling to scatter the light. I took a piss for what felt like an eternity. I'd been holding it all day. I wasn't wanting to stop with those black creatures stalking the woods. After I flushed, I filled the tank with a nearby bucket. I then stepped into the hallway. Instead of walking back to the living room where Jonathan and the man were talking, I walked further into the house towards the master bedroom. I pushed open the door with a loud creak and flicked on my flashlight. The carpet of the room was stained with thick blotches of red blood. I turned towards the bed and saw more of the dark stains covering the blankets. I flicked off my flashlight. He'd killed them. Or he found them dead and he wasn't telling us. I walked towards the living room trying to think of what to do. Jonathan and the man were both still talking. Jonathan's rifle was laying against the couch a few feet to his right, and the man shot a nod in my direction, and I sat down next to Jonathan. My hand was gripping my pistol tightly inside my jacket pocket. The man looked at me, and his smile faltered. "Everything all right, son?" he asked. I turned to Jonathan and tried to keep my voice low so that he could only hear. "I think he killed them inside their..." And I was cut off because in a flash, the man jumped to his feet and pulled the pistol seemingly out of nowhere, and Jonathan froze, his hand half extended towards his rifle. "Hand back, you little bastard," he said, his voice coming in huffs. I heard that door creak.
Why'd you have to do that? He trailed off, switching the pistol back and forth between us. All right, Jonathan said, raising his hands. I kept mine inside my pockets. I see we've been trouble for you. We'll be on our way now. The man then shook his head. So what? You can come back with a mob of your fucking friends? He rubbed at his face. I was starving, okay? And they had food. They gave me some at first, but then they stopped. Our daughter is hungry, blah, blah, blah. He continued to switch, pointing the pistol between us. Jonathan, with his hands still raised in the air, slowly got to his feet. We're going to walk out that door now, sir, very slowly. And then he looked down at me. Milton, go ahead. No fucking way, the man shouted as Jonathan began to walk. You're not going nowhere. He then fired into Jonathan's side. Jonathan grunted and fell to the floor as I pulled the trigger on the pistol, still inside my jacket pocket. It was hard to miss with the man standing so close to me. His arm broke with the impact of my first shot, then most of his head fell apart with my second. I continued to fire as he fell to the floor. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. My pistol was stuck. Somehow the slide had torn the fabric and gotten caught. I knelt down next to Jonathan and was shaking hands, and he coughed and sat up. Well, that figures, he said with a ragged breath. Didn't think I'd go out this way. The bullet hole was just below and outside of his right nipple. Dark blood was already staining his shirt. He coughed into his hand and pulled it away bloody. He stared at it with a grim expression. Lung. He shot me in the lung. Not good. He nodded towards the corpse of the man who I had murdered just seconds before. Go get me his pistol, would you? I ran over to the man I had murdered, doing my best to avoid looking at the bloody ruin that remained on his face. I grabbed the pistol and brought it over to Jonathan. He ejected the slide and looked at the bullets. .22 caliber. Could have been worse, I suppose. I'm probably still going to die, though. Listen, what size shoes do you wear? He looked at me with a confused expression. Well, what does that have to do with anything, he said, and shook his head. I wear size 10s. Good enough. Luna's mom is a doctor. Give me your shoes. I need them to run there in time. Is that so? Jonathan said. The Marstons like ATVs. And Jonathan grit his teeth. Riding one of them will hurt like a bitch, but it'll beat walking. There might be one in the garage. I ran outside where I found a functional ATV. It was a struggle carrying Jonathan out of there, but he managed to steady himself in his seat. I pulled my jacket's hood lower over my eyes and gunned the engine out onto the street. Even with the ATV, it still took almost 20 minutes to get to Luna's house. The water was so deep in places that I thought we'd be swept away or get stuck in mud. Luckily, I avoided the major problems and reached Mrs. Snyder's place. My dad and Mr. Dawson helped carry Jonathan inside. I grabbed his backpack and rifle from where we'd stored it on the back of the ATV and walked inside where Luna was waiting. Mrs. Snyder worked quickly to make an operating room out of their kitchen. She instructed them to drop Jonathan on the kitchen table, then injected him with some kind of painkiller before removing his jacket and shirt. His bullet wound was still dripping blood, but that's not what caught my eye. What caught my eye was a large black scar on the top of his right shoulder. I'd have thought it was a tattoo if it wasn't clearly a cut that separated the skin. Black tendrils stretched out from the wound underneath his skin, moving slowly as if they were trying to grasp and spread. Thunder roared outside, louder and closer than I'd ever heard it before. Jonathan gasped and grabbed at Mrs. Snyder. They're close. They're outside. At least 5 or 6. She then injected him with another dose, and he fell back into unconsciousness. I turned to look at Luna. She was staring at the black tendrils under Jonathan's skin. Dad? Mr. Dawson? I said. And I held up Jonathan's rifle. Do either of you know how to use this? I turned to look out the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I think we're going to need it. Luna held the only source of light, a single LED flashlight, as her mom continued to work on Jonathan's bullet wound. Lightning flashed outside, casting our shadows against the walls of the house. I fumbled with my dad's pistol, trying to eject the magazine to replace the bullets I'd fired earlier that day. Jonathan said there were some of those creatures outside. 5 or 6 at least, I said. Mrs. Snyder looked up from Jonathan's side with a concerned expression. He was just shot. There's no way he could have known that. We need to get to the storm cellar, Luna said. Mom, trust me. The thunder cracked overhead, and Mrs. Snyder looked over at her daughter with a disbelieving expression that melted into a tense one of focus. The backyard was visible through the sliding glass door in the kitchen, lit up by another flash of lightning, and then another. And a tall black figure stood on the grass, silhouetted by the blue blinding light of the lightning strike. Mrs. Snyder turned and began barking orders. Bill, get that rifle and keep it pointed out the back door. Milton, you and Luna go into the front room and get Jill. Luna and I ran down the hallway towards the living room where Jill slept. The storm intensified outside the same way it had when the church had been attacked. We reached Jill where she lay on the couch. The living room had 2 windows, both long since boarded up from the outside, with the next flash of lightning. I saw that one of the wooden boards had been removed. The sound of breaking glass mixed in the space between thunderclaps, and a black hook extended through the slats during the next flash of light. The young Dawson girl was still delirious, so I handed Luna the pistol and threw her over my shoulder. When we reached the kitchen, Mr. Dawson was pointing the rifle at the sliding glass door. He'd turn on a flashlight attached under the barrel, which meant it was easy to see the storm walker on the other side of the glass. His skin was glossy, almost reflective. He reached out with one hooked hand and began tugging at the door. It was locked. Milton, move now, Luna's mom shouted. I carried Jill down the hall towards her, pausing when I heard the sound I'd been dreading. The sliding black door shattered into pieces. I turned to look back in horror. Mr. Dawson, Jill's father, was standing his ground as the 7-foot-tall creature stepped into the house. He fired twice, striking it in the chest. The figure collapsed in a heap, still illuminated by the light coming from Mr. Dawson's gun. Mr. Dawson fired once more into the corpse of the creature. Mrs. Snyder shouted for me to run, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from it. The light from the rifle jerked. I looked up at Mr. Dawson, confused, and another flash of lightning revealed a black hook extending through his chest. His rifle then clattered to the floor. I turned and followed the group towards a set of slanted wooden doors. They led down into a damp concrete cellar that smelled of mold and dripped of water. Not surprising. Some distant part of me thought, it's been raining for a month. Luna shut the wooden doors, then took a step back. I set Jill down near her mother, then returned to Luna's side. She shoved the pistol back into my hands, then held the flashlight with 2 shaking hands. I turned my attention to the slanted doors at the top of the steps. Are there any other entrances to this room? I asked. And Luna shook her head. Each second passed like hours, marked by the rhythmic drip of raindrops down into the cellar. When I shot a look back, all I saw was blackness. The only source of light was the narrow white beam held in Luna's hand. The beam still pointed at the cellar door. One of the doors began to creak open. I fired through the wood, an explosion of the gun deafening us in the small room more than any blast of thunder. Then, the storm truly began. The wind howled, the thunder increased, and the rain poured down. I wondered briefly if this is how the people in Noah's time felt. The flood, the storm that never stopped. Judgment Day. The storm continued to pick up, howling like a freight train overhead. Then, with a sound like the splintering of 100 fallen trees, the house collapsed on the top of the room. The concrete cellar protected us from most of the debris, but that sound was unmistakable. After the collapse, the storm subsided. Luna and I stayed aiming at the door for the next half hour or so, but eventually gave up, figuring the stormwalkers must have either given up or figured we'd died in the collapse. I walked back to the others. Mrs. Dawson cradled Jill, weeping softly about her husband. I shrugged off my raincoat and laid it on the floor for the still delirious Jill to lie on. I didn't know what to say. I barely even knew them. Instead, I gave them space, heading back towards the door. Luna and her mom walked up to me and sat down a few minutes later. "They still out there?" Luna asked softly. "We should ask Jonathan," I said. Mrs. Snyder shook her head, the motion only barely visible in the reflected light of the flashlight. "I injected him with midazolam before I started working on him. He'll be out for another few hours at least." Luna then reached out and picked up the flashlight, aiming it back towards Jonathan. The bright white LED flashlight illuminated his figure. He wasn't on his back as I had expected. He was on his feet, walking towards us. The black tendrils under his skin I'd seen earlier were still visible through his pale skin, and they had spread. His entire right side was black now. The tendrils reached up to his face where they were visible, wrapped around his eye, which was now pure black. Luna panned the light towards Jonathan's right hand. It was bent and twisted with black bones peeking through the skin. Ragged chunks of skin hung off bones which had somehow fused together in a jagged, hooked formation. I jumped to my feet as Jonathan continued to walk towards us. "Jonathan," I called out. "Jonathan, stay where you are, please." He made no reaction whatsoever other than to continue his methodical plodding towards us. Images of the man I'd killed earlier that day flooded my mind. The way his arm had shattered from my first shot, the way his face had deformed with my second. My hand began to shake violently. "Please," I shouted. "Jonathan, please sit the fuck down." Luna took the pistol from my hand. She pointed it alongside the flashlight at Jonathan. He brought his jagged black hand back for a strike. Most of his head then exploded backwards in a shower of black, not red. I couldn't hear anything for another few long minutes. When it finally returned to me, all I heard was the sound of sobs from Mrs. Dawson in the rain. I called my dad over. He'd been cowering somewhere nearby the entire time. Together we shoved the doors open. They'd been interior doors that morning. This time we shoved a layer of wood and drywall off them and stepped directly into the storm. And I thought I knew what it was like to be wet. I've been underwater, for example, jumped in a pool, stepped in a puddle with old shoes, fell in a frozen lake once. But having wet socks is not wet. Even being underwater was not wet. Nearing the end of that march towards the church, I learned what wet was. I carried the young Dawson girl on my back, leading the four others. My dad, Luna, Mrs. Snyder, and Mrs. Dawson towards the church. Every motion released another torrent of water from my sweater like a sponge being gripped too tightly. I was cold, hungry, and too wet to be truly afraid that our small party would be attacked by the stormwalkers. Besides, keeping an eye out for them was Luna's job. The ruins of Luna's house had offered us no protection, so our little caravan decided to make the hour-long trek through the rain and hail. Our spirits only rising when we reached the street, where the church lay. Bishop had seemed like a reasonable man, so I was hopeful we'd be able to convince him to allow us to stay with their congregation. My little flower of hope continued to bloom until I caught a glimpse of the church through the trees. 3/4 of the roof had collapsed, leaving what little remained of the structure in darkness. We stood there, in the pouring rain, staring at the wreckage of our last hope. A curse bubbled to my lips, and I gave a low groan. Luna didn't respond, instead walking forward towards the shelter provided by what remained of the roof. I followed her, settling Jill down onto the ground beneath the overhang. Luna then disappeared into the wreckage. I let her go, too tired to voice a complaint. She reemerged a few minutes later with a pained expression. "Mom," she said, "someone inside needs your help." Mrs. Snyder looked up from where she slumped against the wall, her face gaunt. I wondered when the last time she ate was. I walked over and helped her up. Then the three of us walked into the collapsed building. Jagged pipes crisscrossed the hallway over dust-strewn carpets. At the end of the cramped passageway, we found a man in his late 60s with a large bushy beard propped up against the wall. A 4-foot-long piece of metal rebar poked through his lower abdomen. He looked up at us as we approached. I thought I recognized him from our stay at the church earlier, but I didn't know his name. Mrs. Snyder knelt down. "What's your name, sir?" "Jacob," he said. "What happened here, Jacob?" she asked, pulling out a pair of scissors from her bag. She began cutting away at his shirt near the wound. "They attacked. Those black creatures. We held them off at the doors, but the storm got worse than I'd ever seen it. The wind brought down the walls and the roof." He gave a wet cough. "Like I told the girl, I know I'm gonna die." Mrs. Snyder didn't respond, probing the wound with her fingers. After a long moment, she sat back. "I am sorry. This rebar almost certainly punctured your lower bowels. I'd only be able to fix it with an entire surgery team, and even then, your chances would not be great." The man grunted again. I pulled out my bottle of water and passed it to him. He drained it, then pressed the cool metal against his forehead. "Well then," he said. He shot a look at Luna, who was still staring at him. "Thanks for trying, I suppose." And he gave a faint smile. "You remind me of my granddaughter." Luna continued to stare, her eyebrows knitted together. The man seemed to consider for a long moment. "Do you all have a place to stay?" he asked. "No, we don't," Mrs. Snyder said. And he nodded. "I was a bit of a doomsday prepper. I built a bunker under my backyard, just in case. My old lady gave me so much grief for it, God rest her soul." He trailed off, staring into the distance. "All that work and money, and I didn't even use it when doomsday actually came." "Why aren't you there now?" I said. "Well, I stayed there for the first week, but it was just so goddamn boring. I've been a member of this congregation and knew they were holding out here. I figured there'd be safety in numbers. Goes to show me. 56 Shinkai Street, the one with the lookout tower in the backyard. The key to the padlock is 1277. Good luck. Now go on, get out of here before they come back." We straightened and then made to leave. "Wait," Jacob said. "Luna, was that your name? Can I have a word in private?" I shot a look at Luna, who nodded, and then I followed Mrs. Snyder down the hallway towards my dad. Luna emerged 2 minutes later, her face stony. She sat against the wall before sliding down to the ground. I walked over and sat next to her, bringing my knees against my chest. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yeah, he wanted me to find his gun from under the nearby rubble, so he could end it, if the pain got too bad." "Did you do it?" "Yeah, of course I did," Luna said, staring down at her hands, and she flexed her fingers. "So what do you think about this bunker?" "Well, at this point, the bar is so low that they're tripping over it in hell," she said. "I'm willing to give it a try." We waited under the church for the next hour or so, gathering our energy. I filled up my water bottle from a nearby drain spout, figuring it was clean enough. The address the man had given us was only a few blocks away, but the idea of walking through the ice-cold rain again was almost enough for me to break down in tears. I turned around to look at the others, pity growing in my heart for the huddled figures. My dad and Mrs. Dawson were speaking off to the side. Jill was sleeping, huddled up in a wet blanket next to Luna's mom. Only Luna was still moving, spreading a map out across the dusty carpet to plan our path to the man's house. A wave of affection for her spread over me, suddenly cut off by my memory of Jonathan. He died because I hadn't reached for my gun. If I'd been faster, paid more attention, he might still be alive. The memory of those black tendrils spreading under his skin made me shudder. He'd been infected by that thing, but it hadn't spread until he was already weak from the gunshot wound. I walked over to Luna and got down, pinning a corner of the map with my knee. We needed a plan. We set off through the rain an hour later. I hadn't realized it, but slowing down had allowed a blister on the back of my right heel to fill with fluid. It popped almost immediately, exposing the raw skin underneath. I lowered my head and pressed forward through the rain and sleet and lightning. We saw the lookout tower long before we saw the man's house, a large metal structure stretched some 50 feet into the sky. I was sure lightning would strike it, but it never did. Maybe he'd installed some kind of lightning rod to divert the positive charge. We reached the house a few minutes later, passing through the still unlocked gate into the backyard. The only structure in the backyard aside from the tower was a 10-foot by 10-foot shed in one corner of the yard. I shot Luna a look and then walked up to the shed. A 4-digit cylinder lock was set onto the door. Luna spun the cylinders to enter the numbers and then pushed the door open. Inside the shed, we found a lawnmower, some oversized canisters of gasoline, and a massive metal door set into the concrete floor of the shed. I walked up to the door, turned the heavy handle, and pulled it open. A blast of musty air hit me, old but not unpleasant. I flicked on one of our surviving flashlights and found a ladder leading down into the darkness. "I'll be right back," I said, sticking the flashlight in my mouth and climbing down. I descended some 15 feet before reaching the bottom, hopeful and worried in equal measure. I stepped off the ladder and turned. My light flashing across what looked to be a living room with a large TV set into one wall. A sofa sat in the middle of the room, flanked on the right by a large lazy-boy chair. I stepped forward, marveling. It was the perfect shelter. Even in the dark, and even without air circulation, we'd be able to spend at least a day or two here. Luna then stepped off the ladder behind me. "It looks perfect," I said. I then walked to a nearby door and opened it to reveal an actual hallway. It branched off into a bedroom and a bathroom. At the end, we spotted a half-sized doorway. We approached it and cracked it open to see a smaller generator and what looked to be a hot water heater. "No chance this thing works," I said. "Not a chance in hell." "Well," Luna said, "that's where the bar is, so maybe we've cleared it." Jacob had taped a note that read "electric start" on the side of the generator next to a button. I reached forward almost reverently, pressing the button with a thumb, and it revved to life immediately. Lights throughout the bunker flashed to life, accompanied by the hum of some kind of ventilation system. I wanted to go back up top and bring the others down, but I couldn't. Not yet. There was one more thing as well. I reached around the back of the water heater, then felt the gas hose travel into the wall. There was a chance, however slight, that he had his own propane tank. I turned the dial, then pressed the electric start, and the telltale whoomp of the gas igniting was almost enough to make me cry. Hot water. We had hot fucking water. The next half hour was better than Christmas. Luna and I helped the rest of our group down the ladder, locked the heavy door behind us, then we began to explore. There were 100 movies in plastic sleeves in a cabinet by the TV. There was an honest-to-God thermostat on the wall. And best of all, we found a dozen MREs, military prepackaged meals, stuffed into a cupboard. We tore into those MREs, scarfing down the macaroni, chili, and jalapeno cheese spread. Before we knew it, we'd gone through 3 of them. Some part of me spoke to restraint, but another part of me spoke to happiness. We'd gone weeks without enough food, days without security, and too many nights without sleep. When we'd eaten our fill, we each took turns in the shower. Those 5 minutes under the warm water did more for my sanity than even the food did. We gathered around the living room, speaking quietly with each other when Jill asked for us to play Thor Ragnarok on the TV, and it was almost too much. 2 hours later, we split up to sleep. Mrs. Dawson and Luna's mom and Jill shared the bed in the bedroom, and my dad slept on a mat in the hallway. The couch was open, but Luna and I didn't even have to discuss it. We grabbed a thick blanket from the corner and snuggled into the lazy boy. Luna buried her head against my chest, and I laid back, rubbing my thumb against the back of her hand. "Thanks," I said. "For what?" "You've been holding us all together, maybe even more than your mom." "Thanks for that." I looked down at her. Her eyes were far away. "Are you thinking about Jacob?" "You did the right thing. We're safe here, at least for a week or two. Safer than we've been since the beginning of all this shit." "Yeah, I know I did a brave thing," she said, her eyes coming back into focus. "I just hope it was the right thing." "We're probably still screwed, Milton," she said, gesturing vaguely. "The gas or the food will only last for a few days, and the rain shows no sign of stopping. And all attempts to either escape or communicate with the outside world have failed. Not to mention all the black creatures walking around bringing God's wrath down. Luna, that sounds like a problem for tomorrow." She looked up at me and gave a sheepish smile. I reached down and then gave her a kiss, and she returned it eagerly. Tonight, we were warm, well-fed, and both smelled of Jacob's overpoweringly minty shampoo. And far above us, even the loudest rolling thunder seemed muffled.